Okay, so hi everybody. Welcome to the second day of the online conference Philosophy and Generative Grammar 2. If any of you don't have the conference program, you can find it in the link that David's posting on the chat in case you need it. And without further ado, let's begin. It is my pleasure to introduce the first speaker of the day, Professor Brenda Laca, from Universidad de la República. Her talk is titled Learning from the Past, What the Historical Present Reveals About Tenses.
Okay, thank you. Well, now I'll try to do the trick again and share my screen. Entire screen. Hello. Okay. So can you see it?
Yes, perfect.
So I won't go into the presentation mode. I just show you. Is it? I mean, are the characters big enough that you can read them and so on? Yeah.
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Okay. So because in this way I can see you, otherwise I cannot. So let me first thank David and Raphael for organizing this second edition of Philosophy and Generative Grammar and for having me on board. I am very happy to be here. I am enjoying this conference a lot. I'd like to report on work I have been conducting on the historical present as a mode of discourse, that affects the interpretation not only of the present, but of all tenses. And this work has led me, I would say by sheer serendipity, to a novel proposal for understanding some of the differences between the simple pasts in languages like Spanish or English, on the one hand, and the simple past in languages like French, Italian, or German, on the other. There has always been general awareness of the existence of these differences among researchers, but also, I think, considerable reluctance to tackle the problem. And I think that we may now have the ingredients for a satisfactory analysis of the differences. That's why the title of the talk, which is actually learning from the present, not from the past. This is learning about the past from the present. So this is the plan of the talk. I will first provide some background on the indexicality of tenses and on the closely related distinction between absolute and relative tenses, or absolute and relative uses of tenses, which figure very prominently in the way formal linguists have understood and described the semantic of tenses. I will also briefly introduce what has variously been called two-dimensional or bicontextual approaches to temporal interpretation. Then I will present an analysis for the historical present that relies on a bicontextual approach. And on a third step, which contains the central part of my contribution, I will examine how anteriority in the historical present mode is expressed in two different types of languages, which I have just alluded to, and I will provide analysis for the two types of simple past I've just made reference to. Analysis which hopefully account for the difference in their distribution and interpretation. Finally, I will establish a correlation between one of the types of simple past, which by then we will have defined as a remote past, differing, I mean, from the normal simple past, and a type of present perfect, different from the English or from the Spanish present perfect, which is usually known under the term aoristic present perfect. I will be defending two very general claims. And the first one is that interactions among tenses in the historical present mode suggest that some tenses in some languages are not absolute or indexical tenses, but relative tenses, among them the simple past in English or Spanish. And that other tenses, most notably the simple past in languages whose present perfect has completed the aoristic drift, and possibly the Romance imparfait, are anti-indexical. Anti-indexical, in a sense, to be defined presently, and which involves, for now, necessary dissociation between the time of evaluation and the time of utterance. As for the heuristic drift, do not worry about that. If you're not familiar with the term, we will come to it in due time. So the second my claim I want to make is that the bicontextual approach to the analysis of temporal location, which has been originally proposed for recalcitrant cases, such recalcitrant cases are free indirect discourse, the historical present mode of discourse, and possibly sequence of tense. No? So the bicontextual approach that has been proposed for these recalcitrant cases may be profitably generalized to the semantic analysis of all morphological tenses. This is something not so new. This is something that was proposed quite a while ago under a different guise by Camp and Riley, and is now being proposed under another guise by Anand and Tor Sarvani in a series of recent papers I will be very heavily relying upon here. So in order to make sense of these general claims and of the analysis I will propose, some terminological precisions are necessary. First of all, there is a venerable distinction in the descriptive literature on tenses that opposes absolute and relative tenses. Absolute tenses are necessarily anchored to utterance time. Relative tenses are not necessarily anchored to utterance time. This is as old as Comber's handbook on tense. On the face of it, the distinction between indexical and non-indexical tenses seems to reproduce the absolute relative distinction, but formulated more precisely in the framework of the tenses as pronouns approach. An indexical tense in the tenses of pronouns approach would introduce a temporal variable with a presupposition restricting its location with regard to utterance time, whereas a non-indexical tense would introduce a temporal variable with a presupposition restricting its location with regard to a time, which we will call T0 for time of evaluation, that may or must be distinct from utterance time. Now, there seems to be a very slight difference, if at all, between the distinction between absolute and relative and the distinction between indexical and non-indexical. But the characterization of non-indexical tenses allows us to contemplate at least the possibility of tenses that semantically presuppose a given temporal relation with regard to an evaluation time that is necessarily distinct from utterance time. And this is what I would call these tenses where the time of evaluation must be distinct from utterance time. This is what I would call the anti-indexical tenses. Notice, please, that I am tying indexicality to the context of utterance. That is to say, when I say indexical, I say relative to the context of utterance. And this means that I am also assuming that in every discourse, there is a context of utterance. This may be a real context of utterance, or it may be a constructed context of utterance, as is the case in fictional discourse. Now, this terminological decision may or may not be felicitous, and this idea of speaking about anti-indexical tenses in the sense I've just tried to characterize may not be a very good decision terminologically, so that I will be very thankful if you have any better suggestions as to how to dub this particular phenomenon or this particular kind of tense. What is important to me is not the label, but it is the conceptual distinction between relative tenses, which may but need not bear a presupposition regarding utterance time, and the possibility that some tenses, the ones I am calling anti-indexical, necessarily dissociate evaluation time from utterance time. Now, let me begin illustrating the absolute relative and the indexical, non-indexical distinction by recalling some well-known examples from the sequence of tense literature. In the sequence of tense literature, the Japanese present tense is a prominent example of a relative or non-indexical present tense. Why? Well, because in a present under past configuration, you see here you have the present in the complement clause and you have the past in the matrix clause that we refer to as a present under past configuration. As illustrated by our example one, the present tense in Japanese entails nothing with regard to utterance time. We get here a purely simultaneous reading with regard to the time of the evaluation provided by the matrix attitude. A simultaneous reading that in English, in the English translation, has to be rendered by a morphological past tense. By contrast, the English present tense in the same context, that is what we have in example 2, locally entails something with regard to utterance time. It produces a double axis reading effect, so that in the words modeling what John said, Mary's sickness is not only simultaneous to the time of John's saying, but also to the utterance time at which John's saying is being reported. So the double axis effect is generally, I would say universally attributed to the indexical nature of the English present tense. The English present tense would always carry a simultaneity presupposition with regard to utterance time. Interestingly, this effect only arises in present under past context. As shown in example 3, in present under future context, the indexicality of the English present tense apparently evaporates. 3 does not entail that for John, Mary sickness holds at the time the prediction is formulated, utterance time. It may only hold at a time later than utterance time, but simultaneous to the time of John's saying. So the present under past shows rather clearly, or is normally explained by the indexicality, by the very strong indexicality of the English present tense, as compared to the Japanese present tense, but this indexicality evaporates in present under future context. Now, if we now look at the behavior of the English simple past in past under future context, attitude context, that is what we have in, she will tell you that she wired you the money the day before, we notice that it also has a relative non-indexical interpretation. The time of the wiring of the money is before the future time of the telling, the future time of the attitude. In an indexical interpretation, the time of the wiring should be also before utterance time. And this is possible. I mean, you can also say something like, she will tell you that she wired you the money yesterday. And in this case, I mean, the time of the wiring is also before utterance time. But it is not at all required. And I think that in the case of 4a, with this sort of anaphoric adverbial, you understand that the time of the wiring, the time of the complement clause, is before the future time of the attitude, but not before the time at which I am reporting or predicting the attitude. The French translation 4b, which is a sort of a literal translation of the English 4a, gives you a first taste of the simple past puzzle we will be looking at. The simple past is absolutely impossible in French in this context, okay? It is absolutely excluded. You cannot express anteriority to a future time in French with a simple past. Now, does this have to do with the indexicality of the simple past in French? I will argue that there is only a rather indirect link to indexicality, and that what is at stake here is the fact that the simple past in French, or in French type languages, or the French type simple past, does not convey anteriority to the evaluation time. For one thing, one further symptom of that is the fact that in 5b, in French is the translation of 5a in English. He learned at the time that the Count died in the war. Here, it is also impossible in the past under past context to have a simple past in the complement clause and the complement of the attitude. This means for me that this simple past is not able to express anteriority to a time of evaluation. It is expressing something else, something different. Now, I announced it in the introduction that one of my claims is that the bicontextual approach to the analysis of tenses should be generalized. Now, what is a bicontextual approach? It is one that literally appeals to two temporal contextual parameters in temporal interpretation. One of these contextual parameters is utterance time, and I will refer to the other contextual parameter, as I have been doing already, as T0 or time of evaluation. I am just saying T0 time of evaluation because I want to be non-committal as to the possible association of T0 with a perspectival center or with an assessment judge. Other names for this, we will see presently, call them this time, what I'm calling here time of evaluation has been called perspective time. It has also been called assessment time. This presupposes something as to perspectival centers and as to assessment judges. And I don't want to commit myself to any of these ideas. Now, it seems well established that an adequate analysis of some phenomena in temporal interpretation require a bicontextual approach. Insofar as next to utterance time, another time distinct from utterance time enters into the computation of the temporal configuration. These phenomena, however, have been thought to be rather circumscribed. That's why I have referred to them a moment ago as recalcitrant cases. Clear examples of something that requires a bicontextual approach are the double axis readings we have just seen for the present and past configuration in English, which involve both the now of the attitude holder, that corresponds for me to the time of evaluation, and the speaker's now, which corresponds to utterance time. Another clear example is free indirect discourse. Free indirect discourse is a narrative technique. And in this narrative technique, both the now of the protagonist, time of evaluation, and the now of the narrator, utterance time, are necessary parameters for the temporal interpretation. With examples to illustrate this. If we have the examples of double abscess readings in SOT languages. And in this case, I mean, the normal interpretation of that one would give is that sentence 6, John said that Mary is sick, is taken to mean that Mary's sickness holds at an interval holding, that Mary's sickness holds at an interval comprising both the now of the attitude holder and the utterance time. That is to say, the complement clause is evaluated at two temporal parameters. In free indirect discourse, the situation is slightly different, but it also shows the effects of bicontextualism. As shown by example 7, the Dean like him today, which is understood as an implicit report of John's thought. What you have in brackets doesn't figure in the text. The thought John, coda, in square brackets, is simply there to facilitate, to clarify the interpretation I'm meaning. It is not something that would appear in the text from which the example is extracted. Now, in free and indirect discourse, tenses, what you have in red, are interpreted relative to the now of the narrator. That is utterance time, simplifying it. But temporal adverbials, such as today, are interpreted relative to the now of the protagonist. And this is the defining hallmark of free indirect discourse. Now, in both type of examples, one and the same clause, and this is important, it is one and the same clause, shows not one, but two active temporal parameters, and the interpretations suggested are, in this sense, bicontextual. Now, it is important for me to notice at this point that bicontextualism, in this sense, cannot be assimilated to the phenomenon of indexical shift. Indexical shift, that phenomenon that Julie alluded to in her talk yesterday, is sometimes, I mean, these bicontextual interpretations are sometimes confused with indexical shift, but I do not think it can be the same thing. Because in genuine indexical shift, which is a phenomenon circumscribed to some attitude complements in some languages, what happens in this case is that one contextual parameter gets overwritten or gets shifted inside a clause, and all the material in this clause is sensitive only to the shifted parameter. There is not a second parameter, it is a shifted parameter simply. This is known as the shift together constraint. Now, by contrast, the double access effects and free indirect discourse are bicontextual insofar as, so to say, two nows are involved in the temporal interpretation of a single clause. Okay? And this is not indexical shift, this is something different. Now, as for bicontextualism in temporal interpretation, there is a very important antecedent in a rather neglected section of Camp and Riley's work on tenses. Camp and Riley, starting from some very subtle observations on some narrative uses of past perfects and on some occurrences of the adverb now with the past tense, arrived to the proposal that tense interpretation in general requires two temporal features. One feature relating what they call perspective time to utterance time, and a second feature, the tense in capitals, which relates the reference time and the perspective time. So as I understand this proposal, this is semantic bicontextualism. And I mean by semantic bicontextualism that what they are suggesting quite explicitly is that morphological tenses are taken to conventionally encode these two relations, not only one relation, okay? In a way, the relation between reference time and utterance time is always mediated by a perspective time. And this is also an instance of generalizing to the worst case. That is, in many, or perhaps most uses of tenses, particularly in root context, perspective time and utterance time coincide, so that the two-dimensionality of tenses is not self-evident, really. But some narrative uses of tenses and of indexical adverbials require perspective time and utterance time to be dissociated. This is the old proposal of Camp and Riley, which to my mind has not been sufficiently regarded or exploited. By contrast with the semantic bicontextualism advocated for the analysis of tenses in Camp and Riley, Anand and Torser-Vandani have recently proposed a version of general pragmatic bicontextualism. And in this general pragmatic bicontextualism, linguistic expressions are generally interpreted relative to two contexts, what the utterance context and what they call the assessment context, relying on Macfarlane. And the choice of assessment context is, in their view, the assessment context may diverge from the utterance context, and the choice of assessment context is only pragmatically constrained. As we will presently see, the analysis Anand and Torser-Vandani provide for the historical present in this framework has a number of advantages. However, consideration of what I have introduced as the simple past puzzle, I mean the behavior of the Italian and French simple past, suggests that we should also make room for the semantic bicontextualism advocated by Camp and Riley. We turn now to the bicontextual analysis of the historical present. Now, the historical present is a phenomenon that only arises in narrative discourse. This is something that is circumscribed to narratives. The narratives can be spontaneous oral narratives, or it can be literary fiction, but the phenomenon is constrained to this mode of discourse of narration. It is not a literary technique. Free indirect discourse is a literary technique. This is not a literary technique. It's something that also appears in oral narratives. And it is characterized by the fact that the time of the events described in the present tense precede the real utterance time or the fictive, deconstructed utterance time in the case of fictional discourse. And bounded events, or perfective events, if you want, are normally sequenced according to continuity or advancement of the reference time. I mean, this is the annex relationship. You have a sample of this in this fragment, where the verbal forms in red denote bounded event types, and the events are ordered by the and then relation. No? So first they wrestle the coffin away, then they manage to leave, then they are greeted by a crowd, and then the crowd merges with them, and so on, and then, because they are bounded events. In the bicontextual analysis proposed by Anand and Torsevandani, both the canonical and the historical present receive exactly the same semantic definition. The assignment function G, which gives a value, returns a value for the reference time, is only defined for intervals that are included in one of the contextual parameters, and this one contextual parameter is the assessment time. Why is the interpretation bicontextual? Because it is relative both to assessment time, what we have been calling T0 or time of evaluation, and to utterance time. When assessment time is pragmatically set to utterance time, we get the canonical present, which is the default cause. But when, by a pragmatic convention active in narration, active in narratives, the time of assessment is dissociated and the convention is set earlier than utterance time, then we get the historical present. This is a simple enough solution that accounts, among other things, for what happens with other tenses in the historical present mode of discourse. What happens with other tenses? Because narratives in the historical present mode do not progress just by and then. We get also cases of anteriority and cases of posteriority. Now, events which are not ordered by the annexed, which in general are bounded, or by the overlap relation, are expressed in other tenses, which are likewise not anchored to the real utterance time, but to this assessment time, or this T0, which is previous, which is before, which is earlier than utterance time. So this is what you have in the forms in blue. In the forms in blue, we have events which are anterior to the sequence of events ordered by and then in the red verb forms. You have also a form here that signs as posteriority to one of these, but it is posteriority to this assessment time, which is before utterance time. Now, in this case, anteriority to a time of evaluation that is before utterance time is expressed by the present perfect, but this is not the only possibility. And now, when looking at how anteriority is expressed in the historical present mode in different languages, I made an observation that for me is crucial, and it is the following observation. In Spanish or English, the simple past, along with the present and the past perfect, is used for anteriority in the historical present mode. Whereas in French or Italian, the present simple past is never used for anteriority in the historical present mode. This is a fact that has gone largely unnoticed. At least I haven't found it in any descriptions of the French or Italian simple past, except for a passing allusion by Zucchi as to the inadequacy of the Italian simple past for expressing anteriority in the historical present mode. But for this observation made in passing, we have, I haven't seen this mentioned, I haven't seen this observation before. Now, just to give you an example of how this works and what I'm, on which sort of facts or evidence I'm basing my claim. In a parallel corpus of translations of fragments in the historical present, when you have a simple past in the Spanish original, this is maintained in English, but it is systematically replaced either by a present perfect or by a pluperfect in the French or in the Italian translations. What you see in example 10, you see here you have, this is, the whole fragment is in the historical present. Here you have this simple past form in Spanish, which is rendered as such in the English translation, which I will read, but he does not doubt that they have to somehow, get rid of the subordinate who 4 years earlier got in the way of his primary material destiny. Now, what you see that the forms in French or in Italian are a pluperfect form or a perfect form. This may alternate. But what I want to stress is that this is a clearly recurrent pattern as regards substitution of a simple past by a different expression of anteriority in French and Italian. So it seems, again, that the simple past of the French or Italian type is not available for the expression of anteriority in this context either. Now, let me give you straight away the ingredients of the analysis I propose for these facts. And I'd like to emphasize that these ingredients are not original. They have been either explicitly proposed or suggested by Anand and Torsten Vandani in a series of recent papers. And I'm heavily relying on the ideas of Anand and Torsten Vandani. What I am doing is simply applying their ideas to the issue of the differences between the two types of simple past, one which is available and one which is not available for the expression of anteriority in the historical present mode of discourse. So what I claim is that the historical present is not directly indexical. Its evaluation time is not set to utterance time, but precedes it, and reference time is included in the zero. The French or Italian simple past, which I will dub remote past, express the same relationship between reference time and T0 and between T0 and utterance time as the historical present. The Spanish or English simple past convey an anteriority presupposition. The reference time is before T0. And again, T0 may or may not coincide with utterance time. And finally, backtracking, which is anteriority to a previously mentioned event, is only possible for tenses conveying an anteriority presupposition. You see that the definitions stipulate the same relations between reference time and reference time and utterance time for the historical present and for the French-Italian simple past. 1, 3, and 4, I think this is rather uncontroversial. What is really novel and controversial is the 2, and that is why it is highlighted in blue, the analysis of the type of simple past we find in French or Italian, the remote past, as tenses that do not convey an anteriority presupposition regarding the time of evaluation. Now, a little bit more formally, these are the definitions I propose for the present, for the normal past, let's say, and for the remote past. The present conveys a presupposition of inclusion of the reference time, the value of the assignment function in the time of evaluation, and the time of evaluation may be identical to utterance time, or it may be earlier than utterance time. The past conveys a presupposition of anteriority of the reference time to the time of evaluation, and again, the time of evaluation may or may not be set to utterance time. But the remote past, which I'd like to call anti-indexical, conveys, like the present, a presupposition of inclusion of the reference time in the time of evaluation, not of anteriority, together with a presupposition that the time of evaluation is before utterance time. So the definitions stipulate the same relations between reference time of evaluation and between time of evaluation and utterance time for the remote past and for the historical present. But what is crucial here is that the condition that the time of evaluation is before utterance time is a pragmatic convention, is the result of a pragmatic convention in the case of the historical present, but it is hardwired into the semantics of the remote past. It is a semantic ingredient of the definition of the remote past, of the presupposition conveyed by a remote past. Now, what are the advantages of this analysis? We get a uniform semantic definition for present, with the difference between canonical and historical present accounted for by a different pragmatic convention regarding the setting of time of evaluation. We get different semantic definitions for past and remote past, thus accounting for the different behavior of the simple past in English and the French or Italian simple past. And we get an analogous semantics for the historical present and for remote past. We share the property of not allowing backtracking. Backtracking is simply anteriority to a previously mentioned event, and it comes in two constellations. Let's see first backtracking in the intersentential context. In an intersentential context, when we are dealing with independent sentences, backtracking is known as temporal inversion. Now, temporal inversion is possible for the Spanish and English simple past. If you read 11a, John fell, Max pushed him. Well, given the fact that normally pushing event cause and thus precede falling events, we tend to interpret this as a case of temporal inversion in which the second mentioned event is before the first mentioned event. These are considerations of plausibility. All is well. Now, this is guided by world knowledge, but there is a little turn to it, because this type of interpretation, which comes so naturally in the case of the Spanish-English simple past, is absolutely impossible for the historical present, and it's also impossible for the French or the Italian simple past. I hope you agree with me that in the historical present 11b, at that moment, John falls, Mac pushes him, it is impossible to interpret this in the sense that the pushing precedes the falling. You have to continue with the and then, okay? And the same thing happens with the French simple past in example 11c, which is a literal rendering of the English 11a. Here it is, with the French simple past, it is absolutely impossible to interpret however plausible our plausibility, how much world knowledge we may insert, we will always end up saying no, the pushing is after the falling and not before the falling. Okay?
Brenda, you
Yes,
have 10 minutes left.
Thank you so much. So, that means that there is something in the semantic of the present and in the semantics of the French simple past that blocks this interpretation, which is possible for the English simple past. In the second constellation, in attitude context, we have parallel effects. The English simple past in the complement of an attitude predicate may precede the now of the attitude holder, both in he learned at the time that the count died in the war, or she will tell you that she wired you the money the day before, but the French simple past cannot express anteriority to the time of the attitude with the, it is excluded both when the time of the attitude is past and when the time of the attitude is future. And of course, the historical present cannot do it either. I mean, I think it would be very strange to have something that on that day he learns that the count dies. These dies here cannot be interpreted as preceding the time of the learning, the time of the attitude. Now, the explanation for the exclusion of backtracking in attitude context is quite straightforward. If we follow the semantic definitions I have proposed for present and for remote past. The unavailability of backtracking in the complement clauses of attitude verbs, both for the French simple past and for the historical present, is accounted for by the presupposition they share, namely that the reference time is included in the time of the attitude, in the evaluation time. In the complement clauses of attitude verbs, we know, I mean, this is standard to assume that T0, the time of evaluation, is the now of the attitude holder. So that a present or a remote past with this definition can only have a value that is included in the now of the attitude holder. Things become a little bit more complicated when in the case of backtracking in narratives, or what I've called intersentential backtracking. Because little is known about the constraints on the setting of the time of evaluation when it is not set to utterance time, and when it is not set to the now of an attitude holder in embedded sentences. Obviously, the time of evaluation cannot be set in absolutely free way. The setting of the time of evaluation cannot be completely free. The question is then now, how is the setting of the time of evaluation constrained in narratives? It is not anything goes. I mean, we have to have some constraints to explain what happens. Once we have unmoored the time of evaluation from utterance time, well, we have to know what to do with it. To what can it be anchored, so to say? Now, in order to capture the impossibility of backtracking for the historical present in narratives, the fact that a historical present allows for relation and then an overlap, but never anteriority between successively mentioned events, Anand and Torsavandani have proposed a constraint on assessment time update in narratives that guarantees that the time of evaluation, when it is different from utterance time, is constructed along the narrative. And it is constructed in a certain way. I won't give you the formal definition. We don't have the time for that, but I will try to give you the essence of the proposal. And the essence of the proposal is that if the time of evaluation is not set to utterance time, its local update left aligns with the most recently mentioned eventuality, E0. That is, T0 may not only update, T0 may only update or expand to the right. Now, for tenses which have the presupposition that the time of reference is included in the time of evaluation, this constraint automatically excludes backtracking, while allowing for narrative progression and for overlap. How does this work? Let me show you this rather schematically. What we are trying to explain is why it is not possible for the historical present, at that moment John falls, Mac pushes him, or in French, the remote past, Jean tomba, Max le poussa, why it is not possible to interpret this with temporal inversion. Well, here is the configurations are represented very schematically. The lines correspond to the intervals corresponding to the time of evaluation, to the time of reference, and to the temporal trace of the event. The reference time is included in the time of evaluation by the definition I have given for present and for the remote past. And the temporal trace of the event is included in the reference time because we have perfective aspect in both cases. So, by the constraint formulated by Anand and Torsavandani, this update of the time of evaluation cannot proceed, must left align with this event here, with the temporal trace of this event here. The reference time of the second sentence, which is included by definition of the remote past of the present in this time of evaluation, cannot precede this time. And of course, the temporal trace of the Persian event, which is included by perfectivity here, cannot precede this. No? So this is a way of explaining why we do not get effects of temporal inversion in narratives with the historical present. And by the definition, by the analogous definition I have proposed for the French simple past, it also explains why temporal inversion is impossible with the French simple past. What happens with English or Spanish simple past, which is past? I mean, it's not a remote past. We know that these sentences has this sequence of sentence 1 and sentence 2 have two different interpretations. Jane arrived late, she missed her bus. You can understand them S2 as a consequence or as what follows upon S1. And this will be narration or consequence. And notice that in this case, in both cases, the time of evaluation is set to utterance time. As a result, the reference times are unaltered with regard to each other, but for either the temporal import of the inferred rhetorical relation or the principle of continuity or advancement of error. But what happens in the case of explanation? In the case of explanation, the first sentence is interpreted with a time of evaluation, which equals utterance time. But in the second sentence, the time of evaluation is dissociated from utterance time. It left aligns with the most recently mentioned eventuality, and then we get temporal inversion. That is, temporal inversion arises when the time of evaluation for the second occurrence of past is dissociated or unmoored from utterance time. Now, taking stock, the different semantic definitions proposed for past and for remote past, together with a general pragmatic principle for the setting of the time of evaluation when it is distinct from utterance time, this is the constraint on assessment time update, account for the different behavior of the English, Spanish simple past versus the French Italian simple past as regards backtracking, both in attitude context and in temporal inversion in narratives. So these two different definitions, past and remote past, this is what I repeat here the definitions. This is what seems difference. These two different definitions seem apt to convey the differences in behavior between, at least as far as backtracking is concerned, between, but perhaps not only that, between the English-Spanish simple past on the one hand and French-Italian simple past on the other hand. The question that arises immediately is, why do languages such as French or Italian have a simple past, which is semantically a remote past, whereas English or Spanish have a simple past with the semantics of past? And I am fortunate I won't be able to go into the details here, but just to give you what I take to be the most important correlation. The most important correlation here has to do with the present perfect. So past tenses with the semantic behavior of remote past occur in languages whose present perfects have completed the heuristic drift. What is the heuristic drift? The heuristic drift is a well-attested diachronic process by which a form originating in a resultative construction develops into an expression for perfect aspect and ends up acquiring the semantics of a perfective past. This is a picture of how, of the heuristic drift line, which goes from right, which is perfect, to left, which is past. And as you see, what I want you to notice are two things. First, the position of the Spanish and the English present perfect on this line, which is rather on the side of perfect, and the position of the French and Italian simple past here, which is by the end of the drift. And I also want you to notice a second thing is that here, when you are at this level, the French or the Italian present perfect can express past and can enter into narrative, can be used in narrative progression. Whereas in the case of Spanish or in the case of English, there are no symptoms that the present perfect can express past or enter into narrative progression. So what I'm saying here is that present perfects, which have completed the heuristic drift, may appear in narrative progression, may combine with definite temporal frame adverbials entirely disjoint from utterance time, and are not constrained by any considerations of proximity relevance to utterance time, are in a certain competition with the simple past of languages like Italian and French, which have made of these tenses what we may call anti-indexical or narrative tenses. And these narrative tenses semantically stipulate that the time of evaluation is dissociated, namely it is earlier than utterance time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Brenda. So if you have questions for Brenda, please just raise your hand. Andres?
Yes, thanks a lot, Brenda. It was a great talk. I have a comment and a question.
Mm-hmm.
The comment is related to the fact that in some, for instance, some English dialects, the historical present has some morphological realization. So, for instance, in some variants of Scottish English, you find that the historical present is realized with the S mark, which is used in the present. Like you say something like "I thinks" or something like that. So this relates to the fact that maybe some level of syntactic encoding is also needed for the historical present. These facts were, but I don't know. It's just a data comment. My question is related to a fact I have noticed with respect to the use of the historical present in Spanish. which seems to indicate that we need some extra pragmatic restriction in its use. For instance, one thing is that you cannot interrupt a narrative, an oral narrative in the historical present by another speaker in the historical present. So, for instance, I will say this in Spanish, in Rio Platense,
Okay.
because I cannot say this in English. But suppose this context, someone says something like, ah, no sabes lo que me pasó ayer. Estoy en el bar y de repente cae Pedro y me dice que bla, bla, bla. Okay. For non-English speakers, I just use a oral narrative. And in that context, you cannot interrupt the speaker and say something in the historical present, like, for instance, he says, ah, no sabes lo que me pasó ayer, ayer estoy en el bar y de repente, qué casualidad, yo también estoy en el bar. Right? Totally out, right? It's super odd. You have to interrupt in the past. You have to say, ah, qué casualidad, yo también estaba en el
Yeah,
bar.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yes. So this, for me, is an indication that in addition to all what you said about the historical present, I think I agree, I have to see the details. There is something, a flavor of expressivity in the use of the historical present, which indicates some type of speaker orientation, right? So my question is how to integrate this restriction.
Thank you very much for the observation. I had never, I had no information about this fact of Scottish varieties with a different morphology for the historical present, and I am very thankful for the remark, and I would love, to have the reference to it. For your second observation or question, I fully agree with you that we are not telling the whole story about the historical present with this. I must also say that it has to do with your example. His examples. If I may resume it very briefly to see that I understood the point, is that in a dialogue, if I start telling something in the historical present, my interlocutor, my addressee, cannot interrupt me and continue the story. Start his story with the historical present.
Exactly.
He has to go back to the past. Well, this has to do with the way narratives are constructed. And there I must say, Anand and Torsten Vandani have also part of the story to tell about this. And part of the story is the following. There are two ways to construct a narrative. You can construct a narrative in collaboration with your interlocutor, or you can have two different narratives. If you are constructing a narrative in collaboration with your interlocutor, then it is possible for both of them to use the interlocutor, because in a way it is the same narrative.
Exactly.
But the context in the example you gave, we have two different narratives. I'm telling my story and you want to tell your story. Well, but then do it in the past, okay? Because you are not collaborating, let's say, in constructing the narrative I am constructing. So this is part of the explanation for this is in this. I think it is the most recent paper by Anand and Tosamandani, 2023, which has also a story about how predicates of personal taste and false disagreement function in case of alternating of times, which are really very interesting, but which will lead us to far afield. So.
Thank you. Gracias.
Gracias por la pregunta.
David?
Thank you very much, Brenda. It was fantastic. I would like to ask you something about your example number 3.
Yeah, let me recuperate it.
Yeah.
Let me recover it, okay.
I can put it on the chat now, just to make it easier. The sentence, John will say that Mary is sick.
Yeah.
So there
it is, yeah.
You pointed out that the embedded present in that sentence has a relative interpretation.
Yeah.
But as far as I understand, the sentence is ambiguous. It has also a reading in which the embedded present is understood with respect to the utterance.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So on the one hand, I would like to ask you, so what's your account of that ambiguity? But since the focus of your talk was the embedded past, I would like to know what would you say about like the version of this sentence where the sorry,
Yeah.
so the in which the past so the embedded verb is in the past, like something like John said that Mary was sick. So would you say that there is like a similar ambiguity there or not?
Well, in John said that Mary was sick. I mean, the sequence of tense literature will tell you. I mean, the standard view will tell you that there is an ambiguity, and that the ambiguity is that being sick may be purely simultaneous to the time of the saying, or that it may be anterior to the time of the saying. And normally the second reading is more difficult to obtain because you have to have some contextual support for that. John said that Mary was sick when she arrived, or a couple of days earlier, and so on. No, accounts for that have been mainly syntactic. And they have to do with the possibility of having. I mean, there are three main accounts as far as I see it for the ambiguity. One of them is the old Ogihara's account saying that, well, in a sequence of tense languages like English, past under past offers the possibility of deleting the past, the embedded past feature, and interpreting this as a zero tense that it has to be bound by the upstairs tense, and then you get the purely simultaneous reading. This is one possibility. A variant of this possibility is Kratzer's approach, in which you have semantically always a zero tense in the complement. But the zero tense, when you have the zero tense, the morphological realization of zero tense has to agree with the realization of the upstairs tense. No? So if the upstairs tense is past, you will get the past. And you have the third possibility, which for me is the most interesting because it is the one that gives a nice solution for example 3. Okay, and it is this an idea that has been proposed, I mean, by Stowell as first, is of taking these things, taking tenses to be sort of concord operators, distinguishing between morphological and operator tense, and saying that in the case of John said that Mary was sick, if you get the simultaneous interpretation because you have long distance licensing of the morphological tense in the complement clause, whereas you have the past interpretation. John said that because you are able to introduce an operator tense inside the complement clause. All of this is very fine, and I'm straying a little away from your question. I'm sorry, but this is something that worries me particularly because, and I must tell you that, and then I stop. There are uses of the stative simple past in English in historical present context that contradict all this. I mean, you have simultaneous interpretations for a simple past when the upstairs tense is a historical present, and this is a big puzzle, really. So sorry that's straight, but this is something that has been on my mind for some time. So that
Thank you.
Martina?
Thank you. I just have a brief comment because you said that I really like the talk. You said that you're not quite happy with the term anti-indexical. And so one suggestion would be obviative tense. And I would also like think about how this analysis is there something special about tense as opposed to other indexicals? Because obviative is something that comes from person. Do we find similar things with person? So that's my suggestion.
Thank you very much. This is a great suggestion. Thank you. I'll look into it. Thank you.